Hello and welcome to Sociology. Today we are going to talk about racial and ethnic differences. So race. Race is defined as a socially constructed category of people who are distinguished from each other by select physical characteristics. These traits typically include basic physical attributes such as facial features, body type, skin color, hair texture, and so on. Definitions of race can include biological, legal, and social meanings. So please remember that race is socially constructed, which means constructed by society. Like we talked about in stratification and poverty, race has been constructed throughout time and is in flux constantly. So it has been constructed and defined by our government, by our society, by medical and literary discourse. But I want you to understand that it is socially constructed and it has no basis in biology whatsoever. Ethnicity is a group's ethnicity is based on shared cultural traits such as national origin, religion, and language. Characteristics of ethnic groups also frequently include ascribed membership, sense of community, ethnocentrism, and territoriality. It follows that Jews, Mormons, Hispanics, and Southerners can be considered ethnic groups. Current critical race theory identifies that race and ethnicity are slashed together, right? So race and ethnicity are both culturally and socially constructed. And it is really important to understand and distinguish that there is a intimate relationship between these. So they are, one influences the other and then vice versa. Minority groups. The term minority group identifies those groups that have less access to power and status in society than the dominant group. Size is insignificant in determining whether a group is a minority group. For example, white males are a numerical minority in the US, but are not considered a minority group because of their continued control over the nation's center of powers. So I want us to understand and remember that we have been talking about minority groups through this entire semester and have been exposed to dominant ideology, minority ideology, countergroups, subcultures, things of that nature. A stereotype are exaggerated beliefs usually associated with a group of people and based on race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ability, and things of that nature. Stereotypes generally begin with a particular belief about some characteristics of a group. The belief about a particular group does not have to be based in truth or authenticity. It can be completely false in regards to that particular group. Stereotypes are socially constructed, again, created by society, and continue to exist because we buy into them. It is a belief that is shared with others. It will persist and be generalized to an entire group, thus creating a stereotype. While stereotypes are not always negative, such as Asians being good at math, they distort the reality of an entire group and hold group members to a narrow definition of who they must be. Prejudice is an attitude, usually negative, that is used against an entire group and often based on racial or ethnic characteristics. Often they are based on racial or ethnic characteristics, but not always, and not necessarily. A variety of theories have been offered to explain prejudice. Economic theories of prejudice are based on the idea that racial and ethnic conflict is a function of economic competition. So it's really important to understand the difference between racism, prejudice, and discrimination, and we're going to go over that more in depth. Prejudice is a psychological theories of prejudice argue that prejudice satisfies psychic needs or compensates for various personality defects. Discrimination is the outright exclusion of members of a specific group from certain rights, opportunities, and privileges. Usually the dominant group in a society practices discrimination to protect its advantages, privileges, and interests. Sometimes discrimination be inadvertently reinforced by institutional discrimination. Inadvertently is arguable here, as some identify it as inadvertently or advertently. Racism is the belief that one racial group or category is inherently superior than others. It includes prejudice and discriminatory behaviors based on these beliefs. Racism has three major components. It involves the beliefs of racial superiority, it has an ideology that justifies racial subjugation, and it involves putting that ideology into effect. So if we go back to discrimination, discrimination is the actions or outright exclusion of members. Prejudice is an attitude. So prejudice is thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes. Discrimination is actions or systemic. Racism is systematic. Next, we're going to talk about integration and assimilation. Integration occurs when ethnicity becomes insignificant and everyone can freely and fully participate in social and economic and political mainstream. Assimilation occurs when individuals and groups forsake their own traditions and become part of a different group and tradition. So assimilation is rarely seen in a positive light. We can understand that assimilation is contingent upon individuals and groups forsaking their own cultural tradition. So we see that when an individual becomes assimilated to the dominant group, they no longer have an investment in their particular culture. We see this as an act of survival. So when we see that languages have been eradicated, we see this in indigenous cultures often, that many of the indigenous cultures' languages, practices, and beliefs are slowly or have slowly gone into non-existence or have been erased because of the need to assimilate into the dominant power or dominant culture because of survival. Now we are seeing counter efforts to revitalize languages, revitalize cultural traditions, which is part of these efforts to create pride in who we are for those of us who have been marginalized. The extent to which integration and assimilation has occurred represents what sociologists call social distance, meaning the degree of intimacy and equality between two or more groups. So integration, right? So within integration, we see the degree of intimacy and equality. When we look at equality, we see equal access to resources, as well as equal access to invest in, participate in, and demonstrate pride in your culture. Okay, sorry about that. So cultural pluralism, right, or multiculturalism, and we talked about this previously when we looked at social groups and organizations. Cultural pluralism can be defined as a situation in which the various racial, ethnic, and or other minority groups in a society maintain their distinctive cultural pattern, system, and institution. So when we have multiculturalism, it is looked at as many cultures existing simultaneously. Cultural pluralism is along those same lines, but we see a distinctive cultural patterns and subsystems that individuals of minority groups maintain. Whereas supporters of assimilation and integration seek to eliminate ethnic boundaries, a cultural pluralist wants to retain them. So cultural pluralists argue that groups can coexist by accepting their differences. So when we say that the United States is a melting pot, we look at assimilation and integration, that within this melting pot, they come together into one cohesive culture. But again, with assimilation, they have to forsake or deny or eradicate their investment in participation in that culture. Cultural pluralists argue that it is more like a salad. So within this salad, we can see that each individual component or each culture gets to retain their boundaries. Segregation is the physical and social separation of groups or categories of people. It often results in ethnic enclaves such as Chinatown. De jure segregation is segregation created by law. De facto segregation is segregation that exists even if no law calls for it. So right now we can see a lot of de facto segregation in cities who are segregated by geographical lines. We will watch a video that will explore why this has happened because of the gatekeeping mechanisms that have been set in place by law and by our government that allows some people to purchase property and land in some areas, as well as give them incentives to do so, while they deny access to that for other groups. Mass expulsion and genocide. So mass expulsion is the practice of expelling racial or ethnic groups from their homeland. Genocide is the practice of deliberately destroying an entire race or ethnic group. When we talk about genocide, a lot of people narrowly define genocide as the murdering of particular groups, but we also see cultural genocide alongside that, which is highly connected with assimilation. The term was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944 to describe the heinous crimes committed against Jews in World War II. We also see this connection within colonization and in genocide of indigenous cultures. We can also see this within marginalized communities of forced sterilization and laws prohibiting individuals to marry or procreate. So in the 1990s, the world witnessed the genocide in Rwanda that left over 1 million people dead. So we can see that genocide continues to exist today, and we are having a hard time reconciling this. So we also see this within Boko Haram, which is a militant group which seeks to create a genocide and enslavement of a particular group. So global racial relations. The ranking of people because of race, nationality, religious, and other ethnic and minority affiliations is clearly not unique to the United States. South Africa has a system of racial stratification until the early 1990s. In Brazil, today being white continues to provide access to higher status and privilege. We also see that within communities of color, there is also a hierarchy of lighter skin to darker skin. In North Ireland, Protestants openly discriminated against Catholics until recently. We have also seen within Northern Ireland that there was an effort for genocide, cultural genocide, and racism, as well as classism and cultural prejudice in regards to individuals who are native Irish, who spoke Gaelic, as well as the occupation from Britain. Ethnic antagonism is a mutual opposition, conflict, or hostility among different ethnic groups. It is closely linked to the racial and ethnic stratification of the system. We can also see ethnic antagonism in the split labor market, which is a theory that predicts ethnic antagonism occurs when cheap labor threatens native workers' jobs. Okay, so I'm going to put these films, access to these films, into the discussion board. So make sure that you take notes, make sure that you use sociological language, and then summarize your reactions and answer prompts. I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.